Welcome to my library, dear guest. My name is Ko, and I will be your storyteller. Today's story contains 3 volumes, so please make yourselves comfortable as I tell you a tale of cheating at the table, rage quitting, and eventual meltdowns. I hope you enjoy. Volume 1. First-time DM discovers player cheating. Player rage quits after DM tweaks encounters. By the author, Forlorn King. This story contains spoilers for Lost Mine of Phandelver. I got into the hobby a few years ago. No IRL friends, so I used Roll20 and LFG groups to find games. I had several rough experiences as a player that should be posted here sometime, and ultimately decided to DM the 5e starter set for a group of randos myself. I posted my LFG with the only requirement that players have neither read nor played through the starter set. The game starts off well enough. Everyone gets along, no one has played through the starter set, players are all new to the game, and character creation goes well. Group consisted of me, the DM, a 2-pack of friends who knew each other IRL, Adam and Barry, Rogue and Druid respectively, Deb, an awkward Canadian female monk. Full stop for just a moment. Please, for the love of Ogma, stop using female as a noun to describe someone. It immediately gives off an, in my opinion at least, uneasy feeling. You can just say girl or woman or whatever else, but female just... it makes it sound like certain creatures from the internet you do not want to be associated with. Moving on. At last, there was the cheater, Chris, who rolls a very inhuman paladin with a polearm master feat at level 1. Early on, it's clear Chris is trying to break the game. Instead of following the trail of the goblin tracks to rescue their NPC employer, he pushes for them to go to town first. He doesn't take no for an answer, so the party continues to town to deliver the cart of goods. The town is beset by brigands, and NPCs expressed their concern since their employer was supposed to arrive in town a day ahead of the party. I'm trying to push them back on track without railroading them, but Chris wants to fight brigands instead. The encounter with the bad guys goes as expected for the level 1 party. Everyone but Chris gets dropped by multi-attacks. I had a plan that they got captured should a TPK occur, but Chris uses Polearm Master plus Bless to one-shot the remaining baddies. The group recovers and decide they should go back and try to find their employer. The campaign proceeds, but I start to notice that Chris seems to know exactly what checks to make to avoid all traps, knowing a shortcut to the boss, etc. He plays it off like they're lucky guesses, but his lucky guesses begin to border on clairvoyance. A couple weeks pass, and Adam and Barry complain to me that the game feels like the Chris show. I talk to Chris, and ask that he be conscious of how he's playing to allow others to do their thing sometimes. He apologizes to the group in the next session and passive-aggressively states how he'll play his character less optimally so other players can have their fun. Prick. Everyone else at the table starts having a lot of fun. Except whenever the players are about to execute a plan that may trigger an ambush or a trap or be slightly less than a perfect playthrough, Chris would be like, "Are you sure you want to do that?" It's at this point that Chris's clairvoyance gets passed on to Deb, and it's also at this point where it's revealed that Chris and Deb are now an item both in and out of game. At one point, Deb asks to look for secret doors, and to avoid metagaming after failed checks, I roll behind the screen. I tell her that while her search is thorough, it's just a normal wall. Now, this spot happens to be exactly where the leader of the hideout's secret escape route leads. Chris decides to leave a bear trap and some ball bearings there anyway. I start to suspect that Chris has read or is reading the published module to get ahead. To confirm my suspicions, I decided to tweak encounters. The game becomes a lot of work to prepare, but it's fun to watch Chris get increasingly frustrated as he expends resources to avoid things that aren't there and gets surprised by new stuff. This gets us to an encounter with a banshee. In the published module, the encounter is purely RP to avoid a TPK at level 3 with her whale. They have to flatter her to convince her to share information that they need. I tweaked it so they had to wait for the banshee to show up with a trap in the form of a bejeweled jewelry case, which is locked. Chris seems confused by the setup and keeps saying, "She should be here though." Adam the rogue decides the temptation is too great and tries to pick the lock on the case. Success. They cheer. He opens it to reveal that it was a music box with the effect of her wail inside, but only Adam can hear it. Adam fails and drops to 0. She shows up, pissed. They're extremely unlikely to get the info they need from her now. Adam is dying, so we roll initiative to follow a turn order during this mostly RP encounter. I explain to the party that she doesn't seem to want a fight and seems embarrassed of her own appearance. I suggest that someone should stabilize Adam while the others can attempt to convince her to get the information. Chris is pissed and keeps saying, "This isn't how it goes," over and over. I know for sure that he's been reading the module now. His turn, I remind him that Adam needs healing and there's still there to convince her to give them info. Instead, he finally quits trying to play everything optimally and just tries to smite her. Everyone else playing groans at his decision. With his polearm master, smite, and some inspiration, he comes close to one-shotting the banshee at level 3. The banshee wails for real this time. No one saves. I have them roll death saves, which they all make, so they're just unconscious as a party in the banshee's den. The banshee retreated in shame at her own wretched existence. Chris is livid. He goes off about how overpowered banshees are and how that's why the writers of the module made it so she wouldn't use her whale. I said, "How would you even know that without cheating?" He disconnects right there. Sends me a message over Discord admitting that he'd read the adventure module, but that the game just isn't for him and resigns. I wish I could say that this is where it ended, but 2 weeks later Deb begged me to let him come back to apologize and keep playing. We were also having trouble finding a 4th player, and Adam and Barry just wanted to keep the game going, so the saga continued. I do not understand people who read the modules as they're playing them. What do you gain from knowing exactly what happens? Where is the fun in that? Well, I suppose it all comes back to some people wanting to win at D&D, which just isn't a thing. It's a cooperative game, and the DM isn't your enemy, he's basically your storyteller. And what use is it to spoil yourself with what happens next in that story? All sense of excitement would be gone. Now, I don't know about you, but with the modules I've played so far, which were parts of Curse of Strahd and an ongoing Icewind Dale campaign, our DMs always changed some things up. Some smaller, some bigger. Wizards of the Coast sometimes makes very questionable decisions, and some encounters need to be tweaked so you don't one-shot the party in the very beginning. And from what I've heard, Lost Mine of Phandelver is an especially great offender in this category. So even if it was just to prevent somebody from cheating in this case, I do encourage DMs who like running pre-written adventures to think for themselves at times. Especially when you have a low-level party. Now that that's been said, let's move on to the next part. Volume 2. First time DM catches cheater by tweaking details of published module. Player rage quits. Again. This contains more Lost Mine of Phandelver spoilers. So Chris the cheater comes back to the game, partially because Deb begs me, and partially because we were having a hard time finding a 4th player to play with us. I was desperate not to let my campaign fail, and I foolishly thought letting him back in was the best option. Chris assured the group that he was no longer reading ahead, and he could only vaguely remember details of what was to come. I decided to not take his word for it and continued to tweak things. Sometimes by just a little, but more often by a lot. One of the reasons I ran the module was because I didn't have a ton of time to prepare in my life. Countering his cheating meant more time prepping, and DMing was gradually becoming more of a burden. But at the time, I was really enjoying the creative outlet. The campaign continues. Chris is more careful, letting himself fail at things occasionally, but whenever it really matters, he always miraculously knows exactly what's going to happen next. The RP between Chris and Deb is getting weird too, but is mostly just awkward and not inappropriate. Yet. Adam and Barry are being bros and doing a great job keeping things light and fun while improving their RP skills a lot. The group had finally saved their employer and triumphantly made it back to town. It seemed all that was left was taking on the Lost Mine itself and the mysterious villain of the campaign, the Black Spider. In the first part, I mentioned how Chris pushed the party in the first session to go to Phandalin rather than follow the clear clues of the goblin kidnapping. When it came out that he cheated, Chris sort of bragged one session that he tried that because when he read ahead, he thought the Goblin Cave was boring and wanted to see if he could skip it. The fuck? This is where I made the biggest streak to the adventure. When they got their NPC employer back to town, they were all met with distrust and derision rather than a hero's welcome. See, I had decided that as a consequence of Chris's fuckery at the beginning of the campaign, that the real Sildar had been killed due to their delay, and one of the Black Spider's doppelgangers took his place with the goal of 1. Investigating whether the player's employer had told anyone else the location of the mine, and 2. Consolidating the spider's hold on Phandalin by taking over as Sildar. This included poisoning the town against the adventurers while they were out adventuring. Thus, they were met by an antagonistic new townmaster disguised as Sildar, who was backed up by a militia that was a mix of former Red Brands and local townsfolk. The next couple sessions, Chris was extraordinarily silent at the table. It was as if he utterly lacked all creativity now that we were completely off book. All he could suggest was murder hoboing his way through. When that didn't work, he tried to bully the group into leaving town straight for the mine despite Gundren himself saying this was more important. The other 3 didn't bite. They investigated Sildar and learned he was a faker. They made a deal with the Zens to run the remaining Red Brands out of town, which meant the Zens gained partial control of it. They won the favor of the town by exposing Sildar as a fake. The session climaxed with fake Sildar taking a halfling kid NPC hostage and fleeing to a cave with a passage to the Underdark. Chris is bitching throughout, mostly because he wasted his smite slaying some mooks, and I wouldn't give them a long rest because they had to save the kid. But there was more times where he said, "This isn't right." The showdown with fake Sildar was rad. At first, fake Sildar pretended to be the kid and they couldn't tell which one was real. Barry the druid uses his last spell slot on Moonbeam. Desperate, the fake Sildar grappled the kid and threatened to throw him into a seemingly bottomless pit if they didn't let him go. In Chris's turn, he starts crying. Like really ugly, fully grown-ass man crying. Awkward. He's so upset, yet totally paralyzed about what to do. He passes his turn. The party eventually decides to let the guy go and save the kid. Session over. Adam and Barry are raving about how much fun the session was. Deb is hyped too. That's when Chris goes off about how he feels like I'm fucking with him now because he cheated way back when. He tells the group that the session triggered his anxiety because he didn't know what was going to happen next and begged me and the group to let the game get back on track. I was pretty shitty to him in response, calling him a bitch and suggested he should just quit if the game stressed him out that much. he disconnected. This was followed by a letter to the group about how hurt he was by me singling him out by changing the module and telling a whole long sob story about his life and how D&D is one of his few escapes, and he needs it to feel in control of his shitty life. I was ready to write him off then and there, but no one wanted to play without him, and I was still too much of a pushover at that point in my life to not cut it off. So I let him come back, which is what led to part 3, where the game finally came tumbling down. As much as the author here could have worded things differently, the sentiment is correct. If a game of D&D stresses you out more than it is fun for you, you should quit. I myself was anxious playing at some points too, so I understand where Chris is coming from. However, those instances are very few and far between, so it doesn't even compare to the fun I have at the table. However, if you cannot deal with not knowing what happens next, why play a game that is essentially a game of chance? Why roll dice to determine results? Why play a story-driven game where all of your actions influence what happens next one way or another? Again, I can sympathize with this anxiety, but I am with the author in saying that in this case D&D might not be the best game for you. Knowing all this, let us move on to the last part. Volume 3. Chris the Cheater and the Meltdown of Bryn Shander. This post contains more spoilers for Lost Mine of Phandelver, as well as Storm King's Thunder. Chris rejoins after his sob story and at the behest of the other players who just wanted to play D&D. All that's left is the secret mine that constitutes the finale. The party spends the first session preparing for the trip, and this is where I encounter the first red flag and the first signs that Chris didn't give a fuck and felt like his cheating was now condoned. As part of the prep, Chris makes a point of buying holy water, because you never know when you might need this. Yes, you do, Chris. You know exactly what that's for. It was at this point, too, that Chris and Deb's characters hook up in-game. At the beginning of the campaign, I'd said I didn't want to play through explicit sexual stuff, and everyone agreed. But now, they were role-playing their characters admitting their love for each other, then started awkwardly narrating their resulting PDA. Chris says, "I'd take her to our room in the inn and remove her monk robes." I cut it off and say, let's cut to black here. Your characters shared a room at the inn, and we can leave the rest to the imagination. Chris is miffed, as is Deb. Adam and Barry both reminded them of what we all agreed on in Session 0. I ran the mine pretty much by the book because I didn't have a whole lot of free time to prep, and because Storm King's Thunder just came out, and I had plans to transition from Lost Mine to Phandelver to that module while pretending that I was homebrewing. I figured the adventure would be too new for Chris to cheat with, and was an open enough sandbox to make his cheating not really matter anyway. In the mine, it becomes the Deb and Chris show. They both know exactly when and where enemies are, where to look for, etc. Adam and Barry are getting frustrated. They end up having to take a long rest in the mine. The party locks down a room with some pythons wedged under the doors. Good idea, Barry. On Chris's watch, he decides he wants to narrate slipping into Deb's bedroll. I tell him no. He keeps going. I throw a roaming pack of ghouls at them who barge through the door. Chris is mad because, presumably, Deb's passive perception should have been high enough to have heard them coming. Not when she's occupied with you trying to slip it in, dude. At the end of the day, with no resources, it's a tough fight, and Deb goes down and fails 2 death saves before they can help. The couple is mad because I had interrupted the virtual tabletop sexy times. Barry is mad because his really good idea of locking down the room didn't work. The only other highlight from the mine was the flame skull. Remember the holy water Chris bought? It was for this. It was a tough fight, and Chris wanted to avoid it altogether, but Adam and Barry would sometimes face roll a room just to fuck with Chris. They made it through. Then Chris dumped the holy water on the flame skull's remains, just in case. My eyes rolled out of my head at that point, but I was just going to bear it until Storm King's thunder. Starter set ends. They get some downtime. Squad is now level 5, so we're starting at Chapter 3 of Storm King's Thunder. Storm King's Thunder has 3 ways to run the initial call to action encounter. Each one puts the players in a different town on the Sword Coast, and the encounters are very different. I don't tell them we're running the module, I just give them a quest to get their asses up to a city in the north called Bryn Shander. I am prepping the Bryn Shander encounter and see Chris and Deb are logging into the game in Roll20. They keep making rolls while I'm trying to prep, so I jump into the Discord to ask them to clear out for a bit to see if they need help with something. They were acting out the scenes I wouldn't let them have and didn't notice me enter the chat. So I had to clear my throat and they both just disconnected. I sent them both messages that whatever they do in their own time is whatever, but that they needed to use a personal voice chat for that. No response. The party makes their way to Bryn Shander. With random encounters, Chris doesn't have much to work with, but he was damn sure to know exactly what each enemy's weaknesses were, as well as their HP. Second-guessing my math when he'd expected the enemy to be bloodied. The encounter in Bryn Shander consists of a massive ice giant attack. The players take control of NPCs around town in addition to their characters. If the NPCs survive, they will be rewarded with a quest from that NPC. The group had met some of these NPCs already, but this encounter was how I was introducing others to the party. I drew a giant non-contiguous map of the section of the town to scale down the 3 or 4 separate encounters across the city, and gave NPC stat blocks to each player. Chris insisted on a particular NPC, which was a red flag that maybe I hadn't been crafty enough pretending like I was homebrewing. Like, he really wanted that NPC's quest in particular. I don't even remember what it was, but at the time it stood out as an indication that my attempt to shake his cheating had failed. Either way, battle ensues and Chris is trying to keep his NPC out of danger, but the encounters there were set up to be dangerous. A giant boulder hit NPC Chris and he goes down. No one around has healing and all the medicine checks to stabilize fail. Adam's NPC dies too, but they win the battle and drive off the giants. Chris is clearly upset his NPC is dead. Tries to argue that he should be able to bring the NPC back, etc. I tell him them's the breaks, no resurrection, no retcons. He then has the balls to complain about my choice of town for the first attack. He had apparently read the new adventure module and was hoping I would take them to one of the other towns to start the module instead. Specifically Tribor because it was more interesting. I call him a piece of shit cheater and ask that he leave the game. He says he quits because I wouldn't give him enough RP time with Deb. He and Deb disconnect. Chris left me a message the next day cataloging all his beef with my DM style and how I needed to find a new hobby. Adam and Barry aren't mad at cheating because, after all, even with the cheating we almost died a bunch of times. They still resigned from the game because they didn't feel like finding 2 new players and wanted it to end at the end of the starter set in the first place. So, just like that, the game fizzled out. This story does have a happy ending though. I took about a year off of DMing after that, then found a new group to DM through Tomb of Annihilation. We played every week for a year straight and they got through the whole thing. It was epic and fun and super rewarding. Fuck you, Chris. I believe this goes without saying, but you don't get to be upset because people do not want to listen to your sexually explicit roleplay at the table. You know, if this were another kind of game, or the group had agreed to it, Everyone couldn't care less. But this was specifically agreed upon in Session 0, and even if it hadn't, fade to black in these kinds of situations is usually the default unless stated otherwise. And that's obviously apart from the cheating, but I already said everything I wanted to there, so I will spare you the lecture. Just don't do it. However, this is also partially on the DM. Chris has shown to be a cheater several times over and over again, yet they still let him join the games. At that point, they have no excuses. They knew what they were getting into when Chris didn't stop after calling him out the first time. I understand not wanting the group to fall apart, but you can also play with 3 players, and if Deb would have left too, while it may have taken a little bit of time, one could have looked for another player on Roll20 or another forum, given they said that Roll20 hasn't worked for them. I think they would have gotten somebody who was interested. In the long run, this would have saved them a lot of energy and nerves and prevented the story from escalating. Then again, I'm obviously not in the author's mindset. This is only what I can say from an outsider's perspective. As a DM, you have the power and responsibility to take care of such players at the table, and sometimes just put your foot down and say no. With that out of the way, I wanted to thank you for the warm reception of my last video. Most of you seemed to enjoy the little commentary I provided. So, thank you, and I hope I can continue to improve with time for you. That was it for today's story. I hope you enjoyed your stay and that I will see you again soon. For there are always more stories to be shared.